Welcome to my channel, detailing events throughout the decades. 1987, Herald of Free Enterprise. The MS Herald of Free Enterprise was a roll-on, roll-off ferry. The 8-deck, car and passenger ferry was owned by Townsend Thoresen, and had been designed for rapid loading and unloading on the very competitive cross-channel route. There were no watertight compartments on the ferry. In the late 1970s, Townsend Thoresen commissioned the design and construction of 3 new identical ships for its Dover to Calais route. The ships were branded, the Spirit class, and were named Herald of Free Enterprise, Pride of Free Enterprise and Spirit of Free Enterprise. The Herald of Free Enterprise began service on May 29, 1980. The ferry had 8 decks, A to H. The loading of vehicles onto Deck G was through watertight doors at the bow and stern. The wheelhouse was positioned towards the stern of the ship, making it difficult for the captain to see the bow doors. Loading of vehicles onto Deck E and F was through a weather-tight door at the bow, and an open portal at the stern. On the day of the disaster, the Herald of Free Enterprise was working the route between Dover and the Belgian port of Zeebrugge. This was not the ferry's normal route, and the link span at the dock had not been designed for the Spirit-class vessels. It used a single deck, which prevented the simultaneous loading of both E and G decks, and the ramp could not be raised high enough to reach E deck. To compensate for this, the vessel's bow ballast tanks were filled. Because of a cut-price ticket deal, the ferry was operating at full capacity, which made it difficult to depart on time. The captain and first officer would be reprimanded by the ferry company bosses if the ferry arrived even a few minutes late. It was normal practice for the assistant bosun to close the bow doors, before moorings were dropped. However, the assistant bosun, Mark Stanley, had returned back to his cabin for a short break and fell asleep. He was still asleep when the harbor station's call sounded, and the ship dropped her moorings. First Officer, Leslie Sobel, was required to stay on deck to make sure the doors were closed, but Sobel thought he saw Stanley approaching, and it is believed that, under pressure to get to his harbor station on the bridge, he left Deck G, with the bow doors still open, in expectation that Stanley would arrive in time to close them. Terran Sailing was believed to be the last person on Deck G, and when asked why he didn't close the doors, his reply was, that it wasn't his duty. Captain David Lurie could not see the doors and had assumed that the doors had been closed. He had no indicator lights in the wheelhouse to let him know if this had been done. The disaster took place on March 6, 1987. The ferry left the inner harbor at around 1805, with a crew of 80 and 459 passengers. On the ferry was 81 cars, 3 buses and 47 trucks. It was believed that round 90 seconds after leaving the harbor completely, traveling at 18.9 knots, water began to enter the car deck in large quantities, affecting the ferry's stability. The ferry began to list 30 degrees to port. The ferry then briefly righted herself, before listing to port once more, and then finally capsizing. Water quickly reached electrical systems, plunging the ferry into darkness. The ferry ended up on her side, half submerged on a sandbar. This sandbar prevented the ferry from sinking entirely. The crew on board a nearby dredger noticed the ferry's lights disappear, and quickly notified the port authorities. They also reported that the doors on the ferry appeared to be wide open. The alarm was raised at 1937. Rescue helicopters were quickly dispatched, followed by the Belgian Navy, who were undertaking an exercise in the area. The disaster resulted in the deaths of 193 people, many of whom had been taking advantage of the promotion from the Sun newspaper for cheap tickets. Most victims were trapped inside the ferry and had succumbed to hypothermia. Because of the quick response in rescue efforts, the death toll was reduced. During the rescue, the tide started to rise, and the rescue teams were forced to stop all efforts until the following morning, leaving the last of the people left on board to die of hypothermia. Most windows on the ferry were smashed by the rescuers, and ropes were lowered down to the passengers inside. However, Many of these passengers were too weak from the cold to climb up them. There were a lot of heroic people on board the ferry that night, who managed to save lots of other passengers. In the days that followed, bodies of those who had perished that night were recovered. A public court of inquiry into the disaster was held under British Mr. Justice Barry Sheen in 1987. It found that the sinking was caused by three main factors. Number 1, Stanley's failure to close the bow doors. Number 2, Sable's failure to make sure the bow doors were closed. Number 3, Captain Luray leaving the port, without knowing if the doors were closed. The court determined the immediate cause of the sinking was Stanley's failure to close the doors, and were also critical of Sable, for not being in a position to prevent the disaster, calling his actions the most immediate cause of the sinking. Justice Barry Sheen examined the working practices of the ferry company, from which he concluded that the poor workplace communication and standoff relationship between ship operators and shore-based managers was the root cause of the sinking. He identified this as a disease of sloppiness and negligence at every level of the corporation's hierarchy. The design of the Herald of Free Enterprise was also found to be a contributory cause of the sinking. Unlike other vessels, which are subdivided into watertight compartments, the Herald of Free Enterprise did not have any watertight compartments. Any flooding on the vehicle decks allowed water to flow the full length of the ferry. This issue had been identified as early as 1980, but had not been addressed. The need to adjust the ship's bow trim to use the facilities at the port, and the failure to readjust before the departure were also another factor in the sinking. In October 1983, the Herald of Free Enterprise's sister ship, the Pride of Free Enterprise, had also sailed from Dover with the bow doors open, after the assistant boatswain fell asleep. It is believed that leaving the doors open alone should not have caused the ship to capsize, but tests done by the Danish Maritime Institute after the accident found that once the water began to enter the vehicle deck, it was likely that the vessel would capsize within 30 minutes. In October 1987, a coroner's inquest jury returned verdicts of unlawful killing. 7 people involved were charged with gross negligence manslaughter, and the Operation Ferry Company was charged with corporate manslaughter, but the case collapsed after Mr. Justice Turner directed the jury to acquit the company and the 5 most senior individual defendants. A salvage operation conducted by Smith Towage and Salvage was called on to immediately refloat the ferry. This operation concluded in April 1987, allowing the remaining bodies trapped underwater to be recovered. The ship was then towed back to port, and then onto the yard of Duschelde in Flushing. It had originally been assumed that the ferry could be repaired and continue back to service, however, no buyer was found, and she was sold for scrap. Her final voyage was on October 5, 1987. The Townsend Thorizon brand name was quickly rebranded to P&O European Ferries. The Herald of Free Enterprise caused the highest death toll of any peacetime maritime disaster, involving a British ship. Since the disaster, several improvements to the design of this type of vessel have been made. These include indicators that display the state of the bow doors on the bridge, watertight ramps fitting to the front of the ship, and freeing flaps, allowing water to escape the vehicle deck in the event of flooding. The divers and rescuers were entered the capsized vessel to retrieve bodies, receive psychosocial support. Crew, passengers and rescuers received various medals for their actions on that fateful night. On March 6, 2012, A memorial service was held at St. Mary the Virgin Church in Dover, to mark the 25th anniversary of the disaster. More than 250 bereaved families and friends, as well as survivors, attended. A memorial garden with 25 white roses, was created on the seafront of Dover to mark the anniversary. After the church service, flowers were cast in the sea as a mark of remembrance. Forever remembering those poor souls who perished on that fateful night, may you never be forgotten. Thank you for watching and learning about events throughout history. Please subscribe to my channel to view other events throughout the decades.